The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Peter Newman from AHRI and WeedSmart here. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar today on what is the state of play with glyphosate. It's been a big topic over the last couple of years. We're very fortunate to have Carissa Buckland and Steve Powles presenting today. We did have Matthew Cossey lined up for this one, but unfortunately he's very sick with the flu. So fortunately for us though, Carissa has agreed to step in. So thanks very much, Carissa, and perhaps we'll get Matthew on another day soon. So just while a few more people are joining, it's a very popular webinar. We've got a lot of people coming today. So I'll just do the standard couple of minutes of WeedSmart introduction and housekeeping, and then we'll get into the webinar. So WeedSmart is this industry-funded initiative that we run out of AHRI and WeedSmart. Lisa Mayer at AHRI is the leader of WeedSmart, and we're very grateful for all of the support that we get from all of our industry partners. All of the businesses and organisations above the line there are financial contributors to WeedSmart, with GRDC being the biggest contributor, but also very good support from all of those companies. Great to have these companies who are obviously in competition with each other, but then working together on WeedSmart to put out those good messages about managing herbicide-resistant weeds, and also for issues like this with glyphosate. All of the supporters below the line there are our in-kind supporters. We get fantastic support from lots of organisations around the country. Just a little bit more on the WeedSmart housekeeping. WeedSmart Week is coming up. We've had WeedSmart Week in Emerald last week. It was a great success. And next week we'll be in Horsham. I'm really looking forward to getting over there. So we have one day in the seminar style event and 2 days in the field, checking out a whole heap of very interesting things. So 27th to 29th of August, if you haven't heard about it, take a look at WeedSmart website and hopefully we'll see you there. Now very quickly, just if you haven't done one of these webinars before, the attendees are muted and we do all the speaking. You might have this big box in the middle of your screen blocking things out a bit. If you want to get rid of it, just click on that little white arrow in the orange box there, and that will minimize that. And questions. Webinars really do really well with lots of questions. So please, if you have some questions, feel free to ask them in the questions box. I'll keep an eye on the questions box and we'll stop periodically for questions. We have a lot of people joining today, so we'll try and get around as many questions as possible, but if we don't quite get to you, we'll be probably grouping some questions together. So that's it from me in terms of the WeedSmart housekeeping. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And I'll now introduce Steve Powles and Carissa Buckland, who are joining us today. How are you, Carissa?
Good, thanks, Pete. Really pleased to have the opportunity to talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. And maybe if you just let people know very quickly where you're from and where you are today, Carissa.
Yep, no problem. So I'm Carissa Buckland, the Head of Public Affairs for Bayer Crop Science, formerly of Monsanto, sitting here in Melbourne today, coming to you through the webinar. I'm joined in the room here in Melbourne by Tony May, who many of you will know as the former Managing Director of Monsanto Australia, and now the Head of Marketing for Bayer Crop Science. So we're the Bayer Crop Science team.
Thank you, Carissa, and we'll get onto your presentation in just a minute, but we are also joined today by Professor Steve Powles, who needs a little introduction. How are you, Steve?
Yes, all good, thank you, Peter.
Good to hear from you. And Steve, these days you're sort of in a part-time role at UWA, but also involved in the GRDC board, is that right?
Yes, Peter, I'm 50% half-time as a professor here at the University of Western Australia. So I'm practicing in moving towards retirement at some point in the future. And I'm lucky enough to be a board member of the Grains R&D Corporation based in Canberra.
And also with some farming interest in coconut.
That's correct, just to keep myself nicely grounded.
Yeah, excellent. So, Steve, I might just start with you, just as a broad question to open up. Glyphosate, it's a big herbicide internationally. Can you just give us that little bit of an overview from your perspective of just how important a herbicide is it, and how important it is, obviously, globally?
Yes, glyphosate and its retail names are many because it's an off-patent chemical, was introduced in 1974 by Monsanto and called Roundup, and many people know it as Roundup, but it's got many other retail names now as it's no longer on patent. Now, glyphosate is simply the world's most popular and widely used herbicide. It is used around the planet for a wide variety of uses, and nearly everyone, if not everyone, on this webinar would know about glyphosate. From its introduction in 1974, it's really been instrumental in Australia in our move towards minimum tillage, no tillage agriculture. Now, some people will remember that we started before then moving towards no-till agriculture and using the herbicide spray seed. But when glyphosate came along, it has really dominated the knockdown or burn down herbicide market in Australia and many other countries with big broadacre agriculture like Canada, USA, Brazil, Argentina, and elsewhere. So glyphosate was and is instrumental in no-till agriculture, in knocking down weeds before the crop is seeded. In fact, one of the disadvantages, if you like, of glyphosate is that it's non-selective. That is, it will control a wide range of annual weed species, but it will also, of course, control a wide range of annual crop species. And so until the mid-1990s, the use of glyphosate, the overwhelming use of glyphosate, was in knockdown weed control prior to crop seeding in Australia and elsewhere. Of course, it has many other uses, from weed control in backyards to weed control in national parks. But in 1996, the Monsanto Corporation first introduced so-called Roundup Ready crops. These are crops that are resistant, carry a gene giving resistance to glyphosate, and those crops, particularly Roundup Ready soybean, Roundup Ready maize or corn, and Roundup Ready cotton, became spectacularly adopted in the United States, because what they enabled was the use of glyphosate as a post-emergent herbicide to control a wide range of weed species in standing crops, so-called Roundup Ready crops. And what happened, that caused, it was enormously adopted, those crops, in the United States and then in Brazil and Argentina. And that caused a very large increase in the use of glyphosate globally and really cemented glyphosate as the world's most widely used herbicide. In Australia, glyphosate continued to be the herbicide of choice for non-selective weed control prior to cropping, but also with the introduction in Australia and the deregulation of Roundup Ready cotton and Roundup Ready canola in most states of Australia, Roundup Ready canola, then we started to see in Australia the usage of glyphosate post-emergent in Roundup Ready canola and in Roundup Ready cotton. Nothing like the massive increase in glyphosate usage that occurred in the United States, Brazil and Argentina, more like what happened in Canada. In Australia, Roundup Ready canola became popular but not dominant, and Roundup Ready cotton very popular in Australia. So that's just a little overview, Peter. Of course, there are many other specialist uses of glyphosate. It's the go-to herbicide for people that live in cities and control weeds in their backyard, through to national parks and weed control. Many, many uses, but in agriculture, it's been the no-till usage for burn down weed control, and then with the introduction of Roundup Ready crops, the use of glyphosate as a post-emergent herbicide that have made it by far the world's most widely used herbicide. Peter.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'm not sure if it's still current, but I do remember seeing a slide a few years ago that suggested that you had to add up about the next 10 herbicides to get to the volume of glyphosate that are used globally. So it is the world's biggest herbicide, and there's an enormous volume of it used around the world.
Correct.
Thanks for that overview, Steve. And now we'll move over to Carissa. Carissa's got some slides here, and Carissa from Bayer will give us a bit of an update on what's been going on with glyphosate in recent years, and we will stop for questions periodically. So yeah, please feel free to put your questions in as we go.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Steve, for the context setting. It's really good to have all that detail. And my apologies to those who dialed in to hear, specifically here Matthew Cossey, that his misfortune is my opportunity. I want to thank WeedSmart for giving me the chance to have a chat with everybody about glyphosate. So in my role, I deal a lot more with the public discussion about glyphosate and the reputational issues and what that means, the policymakers' approach to chemicals and glyphosate, and whether there's going to be any regulatory impact. So less on the technical side and more on the, what does the current public discussion mean for your continued access to glyphosate. And in my experience, so we've been dealing with this issue in this context since about 2015. And there have been two really distinct conversations happening right around the globe. And the first one is within the agriculture industry, and it's about the story that Steve just told, which is around the game-changing nature of glyphosate and the capacity it's given the agriculture industry to improve and change techniques and really be used as a tool for modern agriculture. And this is in stark contrast to the other conversation that's going on, which is pretty frustrating and bewildering. And that's the conversation that's happening in courtrooms and in the court of public opinion and in media right around the world. And it's driven by a fear that glyphosate causes cancer. So to get back to how we've gotten to this point in history, I was hoping I might be able to give just a very short history lesson, picking up from where Steve started, as he mentioned that Monsanto patented Roundup and brought it to market back in 1974, and it was a blockbuster product essentially. It remained on patent until the year 2000, and in between 1974 and the year 2000, Monsanto was responsible for a lot of the academic and scientific studies that underpinned the knowledge of glyphosate, and that was, that makes sense because we were the ones who owned the patent, we were the ones getting it registered, we had to provide that information to the regulators. But since it came off patent in the year 2000, as I think Pete mentioned, there's been many generics come onto the market, and in Australia there's something like 500 generic glyphosate products approved for use by the APVMA. In Australia, Roundup makes up about 20% of the market, and the rest is generics. But what that means is that there's been a whole bunch of other companies, other academic institutions, and other scientific bodies that have looked into the science behind glyphosate and rigorously tested the data behind it. So one of the questions I often get asked is, it's clearly just Monsanto data. Nobody else is looking at this. That's patently not true. There's a whole bunch, more than 800 studies on this particular. It's one of the most studied herbicides in the world. So I wanted to, I guess, help understand what happened between 1974 to 2015. In that period, you can see in the green box there, to my knowledge, there were no lawsuits seeking damages over glyphosate cancer claims. And then in 2015, IARC, which is the IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is an agency, not an approval body, but an agency under the World Health Organization. It published its opinion that glyphosate was a probable carcinogen. And then in 2019, you can see the direct result of that is a huge number of plaintiffs have lodged claims in the United States court system seeking damages over glyphosate injury claims. The reason I point this out is because all roads essentially lead back to that IARC opinion. It received huge coverage and has been used essentially by trial lawyers in the US to push along this most recent set of US legal claims. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, in 2015 when they issued their opinion that glyphosate was a probable carcinogen. You can see on the left-hand side there that the way they used to group their classifications are group 1, 2A, 2B and 3. And you can see there that glyphosate sits in group 2A alongside red meat, hot drinks and hairdressing. There's a couple of things to note about the way IARC undertakes its classifications. As I said before, it's not a regulatory agency like our ACVMA. It's an agency that looks at hazard versus risk. So what that means is that they're looking at, under any circumstances, could a particular compound cause injury? Whereas an agency like the ACVMA is looking at what is the possibility in the real world at the levels at which people are exposed and the mitigating circumstances we're able to put around that, what sort of risk is that to humans? So that's the difference between the way IARC goes about looking at a hazard and the way a regulatory agency goes about looking at a risk. Another thing to note about IARC is that it doesn't do its own studies. So it reviews science that's only publicly available. So as I mentioned, there's a whole heap of science that's owned, proprietary owned by the companies that have glyphosate products, including Bayer, but also quite a few others. So they only look at the studies that are available in the public arena. One of the pieces of information that IARC didn't look at, which is quite significant, is one of the biggest real-world or epidemiological studies into the link between farmers and their use of glyphosate and cancer. So in the US, the Agricultural Health Study has tracked more than 89,000 farmers for over 25 years now, and they came out with their opinion or their findings from their study around about the same time as IARC came out with theirs. And this real-world study found that there is no association between glyphosate and cancer, and IARC were admitted that they didn't take into account this particular piece of information when coming up with their opinion. And after IARC has, and in the years since IARC has published their opinion, there's been a lot of picking apart the way they went about making their opinion and the way it's being used by activists and, as I said, trial lawyers to be seen as this sole source of truth about glyphosate, when in fact it stands in, it's an outlier and it stands in contrast to not only regulatory bodies around the world, but also other agencies under the World Health Organization umbrella. So there are actually 3 other agencies under the World Health umbrella that also looked at the issue of glyphosate and cancer, and also came to the conclusion that glyphosate didn't cause cancer. So IARC also stands in contrast to the other agencies under the World Health umbrella.
Carissa, if we can just pause for just a moment, there's just a couple of questions come in. One of the questions is, can you advise on the number of plaintiff claims that have been lodged in Australia? Have there been any?
There has been one lodged in the Victorian Supreme Court by a gardener. So that statement of claim, or that writ, has been lodged in the Supreme Court but hasn't been served to Bayer. So it was lodged about 3 months ago now, and we haven't been served a writ.
Okay. And another question came in, is Bayer doing any evidence-based media promotions on glyphosate to counter the emotionally charged pieces that we're seeing in the media?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I wanted to get to this a bit later on to talk about what we can all do, but yes, we're absolutely distilling the facts around what IARC is and how it has influenced this particular process, but then talking about the data and the science that we've got as well. We've got fact sheets, we've got websites, we've got business cards that we hand out at field days. We've got a whole bunch of information, and CropLife are very, very active on the social media scene with facts and information. The National Farmers Federation has a campaign website and information, and we know they're talking to government and they're talking to all the stakeholders, local government, etc. So there is a real push for us to tell the story, get the facts out there, ensure that people have access to that, to the other side of the story, I guess. But the other side of it is that facts don't always win the day. We'd like them to, but they don't always win people over. So I did want to talk later about, the fact that what this is about isn't just, is glyphosate safe or not? This is about people's concerns about the health of their family, people's concerns about the health of their food, and we need to be able to connect on them to help them understand that we're concerned about the same things. And glyphosate is actually a really great tool in helping us produce great food, look after our families with a product that is low in toxicity, and look after the environment, which is, more and more important to people, particularly in the cities. So there's a really good story that we're able to tell that's not just, it's safe and here's the data, but that, we're all striving for the same things here. And this feeds into a much bigger conversation, not just about the importance of glyphosate, but about helping the wider community understand the modern ways in which we farm.
Yeah, thanks for that. It is always very hard to beat an emotional argument with a rational one, isn't it? So, yeah, big challenge ahead of you there. I should also have mentioned at the beginning that we have a couple of people from CropLife joining us today. Catherine Delbridge and Carl Adamson are also on the line, and if there are any questions of CropLife, we can throw to those guys as well. But I'll let you get back on with it, Carissa. Thanks very much for answering those questions.
Oh, that's all right, no problem. I wanted to jump from IARC as a single opinion and an outlier to contrast it to what's happening with the regulatory bodies around the world. And just to repeat, the IARC, the single IARC opinion that's being used in the trials in the US stands in complete contrast to the findings of all the science-based and robust regulatory agencies around the world. So in Australia, as you know, we've got the APVMA, but around the world, you've got the European Food Safety Agency, you've got Health Canada, you've got the regulators in Japan and Korea and New Zealand, Argentina. All of these countries have looked at glyphosate again post the IARC opinion. So they've all had a look to say, is this new information? Did IARC find something that we should be concerned about? They've all had a look at it again and all come out with statements since that opinion to say, no, glyphosate is safe. It doesn't pose a risk. Use it as per the label instructions. It's frustrating, I guess, and this is one of the difficulties that the weight of evidence and the weight of the regulatory opinion around the world isn't as strong in the media or in the public's mind as that single opinion from IARC. And just to really emphasise that we've got a really great system here in Australia that does provide some very high standards that we as manufacturers need to meet. And set labels that growers need to adhere to as well. So you'll all be aware of the APVMA and their role in the assessment of chemicals in Australia. and this is a crop life slide, and they've put the APVMA registration process over on that right-hand side of the slide. And it's busy, and there's a lot of detail on there, and I think that's really important because it shows that this is there's a really rigorous process in place for a company like ours to get a chemical like glyphosate approved through the system and into the market for safe use. So the APVMA have been very consistent in confirming that they stand by their approval and their statement that glyphosate can be used safely as per the label instructions. So I thought I'd jump into the US. Always lots of questions about what's happening in the US. So earlier on my slide, we saw that there are about 18,000 plus individual plaintiffs on the books at the moment in the US, but only three trials have gone to, three cases have gone to trial in the US to date. So one of those, the very first one, is on appeal and going through that quite lengthy process at the moment. And the second one is about to go to appeal. I think Bayer has just lodged the first appeal documents for the second case. The main point here is that the first jury decision isn't the end of the line. So there's a jury decision, there's been post-trial motions where there's a consideration of whether the damages awarded were appropriate or not, and you may have seen some media that covers big headlines saying that a couple of these plaintiffs have been awarded very, very high numbers of in damages. You might not have seen the media that showed that a lot of those damages have been significantly reduced by half and by more than half. So the moral to the story is, I guess, is there's a lot of noise. There's always a lot of coverage, but it's going to be a long haul doing these sorts of things. So it's early on. There has been a pause in the litigation for the last little while. I think the last jury verdict came out in about March or April. There's been a pause for the summer, and we may see the next one go to trial in October. The first three trials have all been in California, which is a particular particular demographic of its own. The next case, we understand, is likely to go to trial in Missouri, so the Midwest. So I'm not sure whether to expect a different result, but there's been some real frustrations, I think, with the way the trials have proceeded, with the trial judges excluding, for example, the US EPA's decision and their opinion that that glyphosate doesn't cause cancer. That's been excluded from a number of the trials. So whereas other what we would call shonky, dubious, cherry-picked science has been allowed to be included in some of the trials. So the US has a particular system where it's quite easy to bring a court case. There's no win, no fee. There's not a lot of disadvantage in bringing a court case if you think there might be a pot of money there. I guess another point is that the litigation system in the US goes some way to underpinning their the fact that they don't have a great health safety net. So there's always more at play to this than just a simple matter of is the science right or not.
Carissa, am I right that some states of America hear their trials by jury and others don't? Is that correct, or have I got that wrong?
I think it can. I don't know the exact details, but it can vary by jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and whether that's a state trial or whether it's a federal trial as well. And appeals may well judges, as I understand.
Now, there's another long question that's come in, and I won't read the whole question out. I think you've sort of answered it, but it's along the lines of the New South Wales Weeds Officers Association did a technical report comparing IARC versus other research just to see how robust that is and the strength of assessment. Just wondering, the question is, has Bayer done similar comparative analysis looking at different reports?
I think we're very, very much convinced that IARC is not a rigorous process, and there's been a lot of delving into the way IARC went about their creating their opinion, not just by us, but one of the very strong criticisms of the IARC opinion actually comes from the US Environmental Protection Agency. So they released a statement that really picked apart and criticised the fact that they didn't have public consultations, they didn't use peer-reviewed sources for a number of pieces of data. So, yeah, absolutely. I think there's been a lot of analysis of IARC versus other research, and I guess I keep coming back to the fact that we've got experts in regulatory agencies, toxicologists in regulatory agencies right around the world who are all coming to a different conclusion to IARC, which tells you something.
Right, thanks very much. All right, I'll let you get back on with it, and people listening in, please keep the questions coming in. They're fantastic. Thank you.
I thought I'd just jump to a couple of global examples, because I think sometimes we can feel like it's just us fighting this particular battle, and we can feel quite alone. But I can assure you that this is definitely something that, as the agriculture industry, governments, people around the globe are really agitated and activated about managing this issue and helping ensure that we retain access to glyphosate. One of the interesting stories was around the ban that Sri Lanka brought on in their country in 2015. It wasn't actually related to cancer, but more around kidney disease fears. And what they found was that they suffered huge losses, huge yield losses due to weed pressure in their tea industry, which is their most significant industry. And in 2018, they actually repealed the ban on using glyphosate in rubber and tea plantations. So a real recognition that there is consequence if glyphosate is banned. I'd like to touch on the EU, because the EU, as much as it frustrates us, they're a really important part of global acceptance of chemicals. So there was quite a tussle for the re-registration of glyphosate back between 2015 and 2016. There were protests, there was a lot of media, and finally the EU decided that it wouldn't grant the normal 15-year re-registration licence for glyphosate, but they did grant a 5-year one. So it's a bit of a weird outcome, because they've clearly trusted the science enough to allow access to the product, but have cut the time frame down to 5 years, not really based on anything. What it means, though, is that the discussion and the fight, I guess, to get a renewal registration for the glyphosate in the EU starts now. It was interesting to know that there was a collection of governments about a month ago, including Australia, the US, Argentina, Brazil, all the cultivating countries, actually sent a letter through the World Trade Organization, the WTO, calling out the fact that what happens in Europe has an impact for the rest of us. So they're approaching their assessments of chemicals and glyphosate in a hazard-based way and not in a risk-based way. It's quite similar to IARC. And we saw the Austrian Parliament vote the other day to ban glyphosate in Austria. That's got a couple of legislative hoops to get through yet, but there is a real distaste for glyphosate amongst European policymakers. And our government and others joined together to point out through the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that doing that and creating high bars that are impossible to jump over and using hazard-based assessments actually has an impact for cultivating countries that want to trade with Europe. And also it has an impact on African nations that tend to look to Europe, for setting the standards. So, I think it's quite heartening to know that governments and countries around the world are really standing up for a science-based approach to not just glyphosate, but chemicals and modern technologies in general.
We might just pause there for a moment, Carissa. There's been a couple of questions come in around Europe, and I might just throw to Steve Powles as well. Steve, you were recently in Europe at some weeds conferences over there. I was just wondering if you've got any comments to make about what you were hearing at the conference and general discussions while you're in Europe.
Yes, Peter. Well, as Carissa mentioned, attitudes to the use of pesticides and genetically modified crops are somewhat different in Europe compared to some other parts of the world, including Australia. And of course, I've just made a generalisation, and one can't generalise about 300 million people, but evidently from the regulatory environment in Europe, in which genetically modified crops are not registered, there, and a general move in Western Europe to reduce the use of pesticides, there is somewhat a generalised different view. And one of the implications of that, as mentioned, is that there's a renewal period for glyphosate for the EU, but what will happen after that is speculative. My understanding is that France has indicated that it will phase out glyphosate over the next 3 years. Clearly, Austria has done so. So there is a general question mark over the future of not only glyphosate, but because of its importance and its widespread use, particularly glyphosate in Europe, Peter.
Thank you, Steve, for those comments. And one of our listeners has also put in a comment or a little bit of a question that Austria became the first EU country on the 2nd of July to declare a ban on glyphosate. And this person has said that it seems similar to the GMO debate back in Europe many years ago. No reference to scientific reports, but lots of scare tactics. So is that accurate, Carissa, that 2nd of July, Austria was the first EU country to ban glyphosate? And do you have any comments from Bayer's perspective?
Yeah, I think that is accurate. I'm not 100% sure of the date, but there was certainly a vote taken in the Parliament. I believe there's some extra legislative steps that need to happen because Austria is a member state of the EU. There's some oversight by the EU, so it doesn't automatically come into, that isn't automatically implemented just because the Austrian Parliament voted on it. So there's some sort of EU type process that goes through as well. So whether that ban is implemented now or soon, certainly they have shown that there is a real leaning towards a desire for using green industry. There's a real push towards organics, etc., at the expense of things like glyphosate and GM and tools that are, I guess, modern but have been subject to demonisation by some very effective activists in the EU. So I think it's a real shame, and all I hope is that the actions over there don't impact on our ability to access here.
Righto, thanks, Carissa and Steve. Well, we might keep going. I think you've got another slide here relating to Vietnam, Carissa, so I'll let you get back on with it.
Yeah, I wanted to flag Vietnam as well. It's one that received quite a lot of media attention in Australia. I think that's because it's in our backyard and quite an important trading partner for us. So this was coming for a while. So the minister in Vietnam, the agriculture minister, has shown some concern about the way ag chemicals are being used, and it seems that his approach to that is to ban, which is a pretty blunt and heavy-handed approach. So glyphosate is one of a number of chemicals that have been banned in Vietnam. You'll see there that the imports have been banned from the 10th of June this year, and all use of glyphosate will be prohibited from the 10th of June next year. This is important in terms of, for example, Vietnam is our 4th largest trading partner for wheat. So it's just, it doesn't happen automatically. MRLs in the country aren't automatically linked to a ban or a restriction on that particular product in country. But I guess it's just something to have our eyes open to understand that there are consequences and things can lead to other things. And we just, the other thing to point out with the Vietnam example is that there was a huge amount of, I guess, pulling together from the global agriculture industry and cultivating government. So our government, the US government, behind the scenes, there was a lot of, I guess, discussion and engagement and reaching out to the Vietnam government to say, can we share our information? Here's the data we've got that shows that this is, a safe product, etc. So really heartening to know that, that our governments and industry are being very, very proactive when something like this does come up. So unfortunately, that ban has gone ahead, and we'll, I guess, watch with interest to see what happens next. Yeah. So I thought I would just touch on what's happening in Australia. I mentioned the APVMA earlier on in the presentation, and as I said, they continue to state their approval for the product. The APVMA is held in quite high regard by other countries around the world. I just need a cough. Sorry about that.
If you need a moment, Carissa, I can talk to Steve a question. You might want to mute yourself for a moment, Carissa. Yeah, you mute yourself and have a good old-fashioned cough. Steve, one of the questions that's just come in, and it is a big question, I don't know if we can answer it, but is there any data or information about what would happen to global yields of food and fibre should there be, should glyphosate be removed from, and not able to be used at all? Is there any studies on that, Steve, or would we only be speculating?
Oh, well, we would be speculating, Peter, because obviously you can't anything would be modelling that would. What we can say is that glyphosate's very important to Australian and global agriculture, and farmers and all those that advise them and researchers would need to do some hard thinking. I know that France has initiated quite a lot of research through their INRA, the National Agronomic Research Institute in France, to demonstrate how French agriculture could go without glyphosate, but those studies are underway and the outcomes are not evident. So no, there is no such data. Many would speculate, but clearly glyphosate is important, but that's not to say that we wouldn't continue to produce food without glyphosate. In my view, we would, Peter.
Thank you, Steve. And I think Carissa also has a slide on this later on. And also, Steve, I don't know if you've come across this at all, and Carissa will be able to comment in a moment when she comes back, but has the relative carcinogenity of other herbicides been determined and compared to glyphosate? Do you know of any studies around how carcinogenic other herbicides are, and are you aware of any studies, or would you like me to leave that one for Carissa?
The first thing to say is that I'm not an epidemiologist and I'm not a cancer expert, and I think I have to leave it to epidemiologists and cancer experts. Of course, I know how to assess scientific information, but I'm out of my areas of expertise, Peter. Clearly, if a substance is highly carcinogenic, then it is not going to be registered for usage in general. But I think I shouldn't comment about epidemiology and cancer, so I'm not expert enough, Peter.
No problem. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and we don't want to try and be experts and pretend to be experts in areas that we're not. So that's not the objective today. Carissa, are you back? Have you recovered?
I am. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Good to hear. Any comments on those couple of questions there?
I believe there is a study. I'll have to do a bit of a search. I have read about one. I believe it was from the University of Wisconsin, which did rank the relative toxicity of the most popular herbicides, and glyphosate fell into the bottom of that particular ranking. Now, I'm less of a scientist than Steve, so I'd have to go back and check my thoughts on that. But I think the other thing to go back to is the LD50, the Glyphosate 50, and there's some really good graphics around that are simple to digest around where glyphosate sits on that LD50 table, and that's at around the same area as table salt and vinegar. So fairly, it's the dose that makes the poison, as you know.
Yes. And the question about Vietnam, the question here asks if the reaction by Vietnam was based on I think it's Hardeman versus Monsanto verdict, and that Vietnam is allowing more toxic chemicals in than glyphosate. So any comments about where the Vietnam decision came from?
Yeah. That's correct. So in the statement that the Vietnamese government released, they did refer to the outcome in the US, the court outcome in the US, and did say that their decisions were partly based on what they were seeing come out of jury verdicts in the US. So I think you can make a conclusion that this is not a decision made on sound science and good agricultural policy. This is a decision that is political. And I think you can contrast it to the Minister or the Secretary for Agriculture in the US, who pointed out that not even the legislator or the policymakers in the US are making policy based on the outcome of US court cases. So it's difficult to understand.
Yeah. Fair enough. Catherine from CropLife has also added a comment here that Asian farmers would see annual weed control costs increase by $1.4 to $1.9 billion, I assume, per year, due to potential restrictions on glyphosate, and that's from a PG Economics paper published in March. Thank you for that comment, Catherine. We've got about 15 minutes to go, so Carissa, I might just let you continue on. There's a few other questions already loaded up here. We'll let you finish off your slides, and then we'll just go to those questions.
No problem. I wanted to just point out that in Australia, and unlike Vietnam, actually, we have a very active farmer and commodity groups who have been speaking up, doing media interviews on social media, talking to government, talking to local councils, etc., about just the facts around glyphosate. And that's actually in stark contrast to somewhere like Vietnam, which doesn't have a really well-organised agricultural leadership. So it points to the fact that there is so much value in having our growers and our industry supply chain and everyone involved in the ag industry willing to speak up and to talk about not the bits that you aren't expert in, but the bits you are an expert in, which is that you use it and this is why you use it and this is your experience of using it, and how that fits into your I guess the way you have chosen to the commitment to farming, etc. So it's all about being able to bring that discussion up into glyphosate is safe, backed by the APVMA. But here's my story about why I use it and why I need chemicals. And that's been really, really powerful in Australia. It's worthwhile talking about local councils briefly. So local councils are, many are reviewing their use of glyphosate due to public interest. There has been a fair bit of pressure on particular local councils. We saw a strike in Blacktown in Sydney, which saw pressure on that council to stop using glyphosate. There was a union element to that. There's been some interest in Wollongong Council and the way they're managing their huge weed burden along the escarpment there, and many other councils. So we actually went along to the Local Government Association conference in Canberra and had a stand and put a sign up saying, let's talk about glyphosate. And we had 60 or so mayors and councillors come and talk to us. And their main message to us was, we just need some facts. We've been using glyphosate forever. It's a really important part of the way we manage weeds in our areas and, increase the livability and the recreation opportunities in our councils. But we just need some facts. So they were happy with that. And I think, there'll be some councils who'll choose to try other methods, weed steaming, etc., hand weeding. And there are certainly councils that are going through really logical trials, like the Hobart City Council, which is undertook a trial where they used glyphosate on one side of the street and they used steam weeding on the other side of the street, and were able to come up with some good data about the costs of each of those methods and the effectiveness of each of those methods, and have a sensible conversation with their constituents and within council. The other thing. So there's a lot of headlines, but I'm not certain that it's quite the crisis that sometimes the media makes it out to be. The other thing that we are seeing is that many local councils are taking this as an opportunity to review their chemical handling practices, their training for staff, their PPE, and all those sorts of things. So if that's an outcome of some pressure around this issue, then I think that's a positive one.
I think that's a really good point, isn't it, Carissa, that we really need to respect all agricultural pesticides and use protective clothing. And I think glyphosate perhaps is that product where we've always rated it as being very safe, and perhaps the usage of it has been a bit lax at times by people, including myself, whereas really we can use this as a positive thing and say, right, well, let's just make sure that we use all of our pesticides safely and reduce risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Even, I guess, to the point where there was a Senate inquiry, and one of the questions that one of the senators asked was, can I spray glyphosate while wearing my thongs in my garden? So there's a real amount of education to do just around the very simple practices of any chemical handling. Just moving on, this is my second last slide, and it's a slide of a bunch of material that CropLife have put together. So there was a question earlier about, are we getting out there with the facts, etc. This is a real a demonstration of trying to mix the facts with the values and the humanity, the human face of farming. So you can see here that we've got a good mix between the data and the science, and showing the some of the questions around IARC, plus the family, the farmers, the growers who use it, and their kids, and why they're using it. So I think one of the main points for me here is that sometimes this issue feels huge, and it is. It's globally significant. It's really complex, and there's so many moving parts to it that it sometimes feels very overwhelming. But there is a role for every one of us to play in this, and whether it's CropLife and industry organisations and ourselves having those conversations with government and regulators, and ensuring that the key decision makers are well aware of the facts. That's one part of it. But there's also a role for each and every one of us. We're all part of a soccer team. We've got kids in netball. We're part of a Rotary club. We all know our local councillors. There is a role here to share the story that you've got to help build that, I guess, the brick by brick, the story about why glyphosate is important, and build that up into why modern farming, why we farm the way we do, and why we need access to technology and progress and innovation, and that stopping things because of fear rather than fact, is only going to lead us down a path of higher food prices and lower quality food. So, yeah, I just wanted to encourage everyone to feel confident in the role that you've got in telling this story and getting out, and every conversation we have on this is worthwhile. So another thing that we're doing, so we've reached out to local government. We also recognise there's a lack of understanding in the health industry. So we've got meetings with doctors and medical associations, etc., to help the medical community understand that intersection between the role of pesticides and herbicides in public health, essentially, from being able to produce great nutritious food, but also to control weeds, which helps with things like snake bites. So there's a real intersection there between health and agriculture, and so we're trying to reach out to some of those people as well and talk to Newman and different people about farming, about glyphosate, but also about just the fact that farming in general is progressing and moving and innovating, and we want our regulatory systems and our communities to keep up and support us. So I might leave it there. Pete, I've got some helpful websites up there. The very last one, croplife.org.au, should be croplife.org.au/glyphosate. So there is so much information out there on glyphosate. So you can go to the Bayer website. We've got downloadable fact sheets there if you felt like you wanted to print off some fact sheets. If you're a consultant or a rural co type provider, there's information there if you think it's useful. There's also two websites I wanted to point out. glyphosatelitigationfacts.com. That's very wordy, but it's essentially Bayer is putting up all of the court documents related to the litigation, and there's a lot of information up there, but if you're very interested in the court cases, it's all there. You can read the appeal documents, you can read the arguments. It's all there on the website. The other one, which you might not, just so you know it's there, cropsciencetransparency.bayer.com. We have put all of our glyphosate studies on that website. So you can download all of the data, which has previously been confidential and proprietary, that is now on the website, and you can download it if you're interested in that heavy data behind the science. That farmers.org.au is the National Farmers Federation. They've got a campaign page. They're on Twitter, they're on Facebook, they're putting stuff out about glyphosate, which you can reshare if you felt like it. And CropLife, as I said, .org.au/glyphosate. They've got a really great double-sided pamphlet that is downloadable and printable, which talks about the myths around glyphosate. So that could be handy as well. They're also on Twitter and sharing some really great resources about glyphosate. So there's a whole bunch of information out there, and encourage you to have a look when you've got the time and get in touch with me. My Twitter handle is @CLBuckland, and let me know what you need, and we can help. So thank you, Peter. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Fantastic, and thank you very much, Carissa, particularly as you stepped in at the last minute with Matthew being sick, and you've done a brilliant job. Now, we are at the end of our advertised time, but I think we will just let it run for another 10 minutes to answer some questions. So if you do have to leave, then that's fine, but if you do want to stay on and listen to some of these questions, or even ask one or two more yourself, yeah, please stay on. So Carissa and Steve, and maybe we'll start with you, Carissa. Some of the questions coming in are around what does farming or agriculture look like without glyphosate? Do you think we can, how do we go continuing farming like we are now without glyphosate? Carissa?
I think we've got some live examples of that, not in Australia, but as a point of view, Vietnam will be a great case study into how they manage over the next little while, and whether that causes them to innovate and find a great new way of doing things. I think we've got Sri Lanka, which showed that it was very, very difficult to cope. Look, I think glyphosate is not the silver bullet. You know, it's a great product, but it's also not the only thing that should be used in an integrated weed management system. And every company, every chemical company around the world is looking for the next glyphosate, but we've been looking for it for 40 years now. So I think there's a whole lot of alternatives and other things that we could be using. But I think that the key for me is that glyphosate is almost like the plug in the damn wall. If we lose access to glyphosate, what else will we lose access to?
Yeah, and as we know, the alternative knockdown herbicides that we have in Australia are a lot more toxic than glyphosate. And you've actually answered another question there about new chemistries being developed. And as you said, every chemical company has been trying for 40 years to come up with something like glyphosate, and we haven't had it yet. Not to say it will never happen, but there's a lot of effort going on there. What about you, Steve? Any comments about life after glyph, as I like to call it?
Yes, well, as you just mentioned there, if it was just that simple change, then many Australian farmers would adopt the alternative herbicides such as paraquat, glyphosate, if they didn't have glyphosate now. But as you could well state yourself, Peter, good farming is all about rotations and running weed seed banks to very low levels, and we would adjust and do things differently to farm with low weed seed banks and use the integrated strategies. It is all easier with glyphosate, but I would like to think that no professional Australian farmer couldn't do without one of their key inputs. There are many ways of doing things, and human innovation would come in if there were no alternatives. I'm not advocating for that, Peter, but I don't believe it would be the end of farming as we know it if it came to pass.
Yeah, I think necessity is the mother of invention. However, look, it would make things a lot harder, wouldn't it? And we would, I believe, see a definite drop in productivity globally, but how much so, we can only speculate. Now, there are a couple of other questions about glyphosate building up in soils or glyphosate bioaccumulating or those sorts of questions. Have you got any comments about that, Carissa, firstly?
No, I'm going to hand that over to Steve.
Okay, Steve. So the questions are specifically, does glyphosate bioaccumulate, and does glyphosate build up in the soil?
Glyphosate's a very simple molecule, and it's easily degraded by soil bugs or soil microbes. So glyphosate is easily degraded and does not bioaccumulate. And that's one of its advantages. It's very quickly broken down in the soil, except in soils with very, very low soil microbial content. So no, it doesn't bioaccumulate. That doesn't mean that residues can't be detected of glyphosate. The ability of modern analytical techniques to pick up very, very low concentrations of glyphosate or other chemicals is very high. So it is possible to find very low concentrations, and that's one of the issues, because glyphosate is used in so many different ways in so many different places that it is possible to find residues at very low levels. But no, Peter, even though glyphosate is widely used, it does not bioaccumulate.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I guess in a similar line, Steve, there's also a question about, there was a paper stating that glyphosate acts as an antibiotic, therefore is harmful in the animal gut. Is there any truth in that? Do you know of that paper? Is there any antibiotic effect of glyphosate?
There are lots of papers about glyphosate with depending on how we define a paper and how we define the quality of the study. I don't know that particular paper. I've never seen any evidence that at the doses of glyphosate that are used, that it has antibacterial properties. So while I cannot comment on that particular paper, I have no reason to believe that glyphosate has antibacterial properties. And as I've just said, it's readily degraded by soil microbes. So, yeah, I can't comment further, Peter.
No problem, Steve. Well, I think that pretty much answers most of the questions. There's one or two other questions out there, but I think we've covered most of the information for those questions. So we might leave it there. And Shannon, perhaps if you hand back to me to give one more plug to WeedSmart Week. Thank you very much, Carissa and Steve, for joining us today, and for everyone tuning in. We really appreciate the effort that you put into that presentation, Carissa, and yeah, any final comments from you, Carissa, about the future that's with Bayer and the battle against the anti-glyphosate sentiment?
Oh, absolutely. I want to end on a positive note. I'm really optimistic. There's a lot of great technologies coming through, not just our pipeline, but in general, there's a huge interest in technology from GM to digital to new chemicals coming through, and if we're able to access them, if we're able to ensure that we have science-based approaches to these sorts of things, then I'm really excited about where agriculture is headed, and the things that you guys are going to have access to over the next couple of decades is unimaginable at the moment, but it's really exciting.
Thank you very much for those positive comments to finish. And Steve, any closing comments?
Peter, I just would state that I've been a long-term user of glyphosate, both in practical farming and other uses and in research. And as you mentioned earlier, I've also been, because I believe that glyphosate was quite safe, I have not been as careful as I should have been with the use of glyphosate, and I will continue, I'm speaking just personally, I will continue to use glyphosate while ever it is registered by the regulatory agency in Australia, and I'll particularly listen to the view of APVMA and EPA. But I personally, and I would urge everybody else, to use the personal protective equipment of PVC gloves that reach to the elbows, and a face mask, or at least goggles, when that's what the label says for the use of glyphosate. And I think that's what some of these epidemiologists that are investigating whether there's a linkage between long-term glyphosate usage and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma would also state, that just to be careful, make sure that users use the personal protective equipment that's on the label for the use of glyphosate, and that will be what I do and what I will advocate for anyone else that I talk to in the use of glyphosate. And I'm sure you will, Peter, perhaps in a way that you might not have done in the past.
Absolutely, Steve. My attitude has always been that the horse always kicks and the gun is always loaded, and the pesticide is always to some degree poisonous. So I think all pesticides should be respected, and we should use the, assume that they are poisonous and use protective clothing and make sure that we don't get overexposed. So I think if we all have that attitude, that we won't have problems. But we do need to keep on top of things and ensure that we are using the latest information to constantly review our pesticides and the way that we use them. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Carissa and Steve, once again, and everyone for joining us. We appreciate all of your questions, and really good webinar today, and thank you very much, everyone. So just a final plug, WeedSmart Week next week in Horsham. Hopefully we'll see see some of you there. They're always great weeks. We have a one-day seminar and 2 days in the field, and I'm really looking forward to heading to Victoria, and apparently they've got some very nice crops in that region this year, so yeah, looking forward to getting over there. So thanks everyone, and the recording from this webinar will go up on the WeedSmart website should you wish to share it, so please do so, and we'll see you all at the next WeedSmart webinar when we organise the next one. Thanks very much.